Hey, look, everyone, it's the Chuckernaut! So, like I mentioned at the end of last week's video, if you watched that, this week is a smorgasbord of stories that I've either missed or, for the most part, are alternate universes based around the X-Men, with a smattering of issues from 2 volumes of What If, as well as Wolverine Save the Tiger, and Marvel and DC Present featuring the Uncanny X-Men and the new Teen Titans. Jesus, that's a mouthful. I'm going to start with the What If issues, as I have less to say about them, both individually and just as a whole. But if you are only interested in the other 2 stories, no worries. As always, there are time codes in the description for each of those books, and you should be able to see the chapters in the video timeline bar. But without further ado, for the What If issues I read, What If, Volume 1, Issues 27, What If the Phoenix Had Not Died, 31, What If Wolverine Had Killed the Hulk, 33, What If Dazzler Became the Herald of Galactus, and 37, What If the Beast Had truly become a beast. On top of that, I also read What If Ellipses, Volume 1, Issue 6, What If the X-Men Had Lost Inferno, 7, What If Wolverine was an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., 9, What If the new X-Men had died on their very first mission, 12, What If the X-Men had stayed in Asgard, 13, What If Professor X had become the Juggernaut, and 16, What If Wolverine had lived during the age of Conan the Barbarian. Now, I should also mention that a good many of these issues have backup stories, or in one case, is the backup story. And just for honesty's sake, I did not read those extra stories. This series is all about me reading every X-Men comic ever. I don't need those extra What If stories bloating up this series even more than it already is. There's like 8,000 X-Men comics that I have to read. I don't need more What If stories. But, so just to get that out of the way, I did not read the entirety of these What If issues if I didn't have to. And that really shouldn't matter, but just for something to be keep in mind, especially when it comes to the rankings of these books and these kind of series. And again, I'm only ranking the issues I read and the parts of those that I read. So the rankings for these What If stuff may be a bit weird. The stories here are actually proper What If stories, single issue one-offs that each go through a different theoretical scenario about what might have happened had an event gone differently, not whatever serialized bullshit hell the MCU show was. On the whole, I thought all of these stories were fairly good. They did surprise me in places, especially with how brutal some of them turned out to be, but they weren't all doom and gloom, and there were a few that were actually on the positive side. Of the 4 issues of What If, Volume 1, I think the first 2 I read, issues 27 and 31, were the better ones. 27 actually starts with the original ending of the Dark Phoenix saga, which is cool, and the effect that Jean has on the team dynamic is neat. But the whole hunger thing it has with the Phoenix really bothers me. Yes, she ate a son when she was Dark Phoenix, but that's the only instance of it happening, and it only happened because Jean and the power was corrupted, manipulated, and abused by Mastermind. Phoenix Force is the literal embodiment of life, and it just feels weird to me that it would have this hunger to it that requires it to destroy suns and planets. The story itself is still good. I just think that part of it kind of misses the whole point of the Phoenix Force and what the cause of the Dark Phoenix is. 31 is neat as well and goes in a direction I didn't expect based on the title, with Logan ending up joining the OG Brotherhood, or, well, a version of it. This is very clearly before they had worked out what Wolverine's regen power are, because even where he is at the point where I'm reading in the comics, which is like the late 80s, he would have survived the wound Magneto gave him with his own claws. I digress, though. The story is still pretty enjoyable. 33 and 37 are fine for what they are, but they didn't really impress me in any way, at least not as much as the other 2 did. But I will say it was really neat that the Dazzler story was written by one of the writers who wrote this original story it spins off of. I don't really have anything else to say really about 37. It's an interesting idea and it doesn't overstay its welcome, so that's nice, but that's kind of it. I have real no opinions on it. As a whole, I give this first volume of What If, based solely on these 4 stories, a 6.5. There's nothing really about them to write home about, but they weren't necessarily bad either, just pretty middle of the road. This brings us to the 6 stories of What If Ellipses Volume 1. I don't know why a single ellipses is all it takes to consider a book to also be a Volume 1, despite clearly being a revival of the idea which already had a Volume 1. So I feel like What If Ellipses should just be What If Volume 2, but whatever. I'll just have to deal with it. These were an improvement for the most part over the last 4 issues from What If Volume 1. The weakest one, in my opinion, was 16, which was the Conan one, but I think that's just because I have no real connection to Conan as a character or his world. So this crossover between Conan and Wolverine did really nothing for me personally. But if you like Conan, you might get a kick out of this one, and if so, more power to you. It just wasn't my speed. Issue 6 was a little disappointing. I still enjoyed it, but it didn't live up to the actual event of Inferno, which I guess in retrospect does kind of make sense. They did have to condense this whole ending into a single issue. But still, it felt very underwhelming of a story. I also wish it had more X-Men characters in it, but they just fucking execute the entirety of X-Men and X-Factor immediately and just forget about the New Mutants, Exterminators, and Nightcrawler. 7 surprised me. It goes out of its way to tell you at the end that this was the good timeline. It specifically calls out that he stops the Sentinel Project, which in turn prevents both Days of Future Past and the Phoenix Saga. Honestly, I think it would probably also prevent Mutant Massacre, Fall of the Mutants, and Inferno, or at least as we currently know them. On top of that, it also is just a really good story. It's action-packed and just generally a lot of fun. So yeah, go read this one. The next 2 issues, 9 and 12, are kind of similar in a way, as they aren't necessarily bad endings, just very different. 9 has the X-Men all die at the end of Giant Size, leaving Beast to form a new team of X-Men to fight Nefaria, and it is an interesting roster. And that's kind of all I have to say about it. It's a fine story, but yeah, the most interesting part about it is the roster of mutants he gets. 12 is a much more interesting concept for a what if story, and it's not one I would have immediately thought of to do. It has the X-Men and New Mutants kind of split in half, with half of them going back to Earth and the other half staying on Asgard. And the shifts for each character are way more dynamic than I would have thought. Storm ends up ruling Asgard, Danny ends up ruling Hell, Sam becomes King of the Dwarves, Rain becomes Queen of the Wolves, Ilyana being Asgard's main sorceress. Wow, I'm realizing just how many of them end up as royalty. But not all of them, though. Rogue ends up marrying Fandril, Nightcrawler takes Fandril's place on the Warriors 3, and Sunspot just fucking dies. Oh, and I guess Doug is in the library just reading everything. Oh, and on Earth, since most of the New Mutants stayed behind, that team is dissolved into the X-Men, and they have this crazy large team. Jean, what the fuck are you wearing? And why are you still called Marvel Girl? There are some things in here that are mentioned that I don't remember from the original story, such as Warlock being unable to transform Asgardian material, or Rogue's powers not working on Asgardians. Maybe I just forgot those plot points? I don't know. But I'm not really holding it against this book. This was probably one of my favorites of the entire batch. Speaking of favorites, this last one is another one of them. It is all about Chuck becoming a fascist dictator because he's literally an unstoppable telepath, but we get Scott and company teaming up with Magneto and Kane Marco to defeat the Chuckernaut, as it is, by ejecting him into space. The new suits are goofy and have this weird, like, New Gods look to them. The way Chuck defeats all of the existing heroes is extremely funny, and the premise is pretty far out there as far as a what if story goes. I do find it interesting that there was no mention of Wolverine or Storm, or even the New Mutants, but that one is not as surprising. But hey, we got Sauron and Unis, so that's something, I guess. That's kind of it for all the what if stories, though. They were all pretty good for the most part, and I enjoyed them for what they were, as I never really felt like I wanted more or was missing out on anything when I finished reading each issue, which I think is a good sign of a what if. And if you think I'm missing any, don't worry, there'll be a bunch more down the line. So if there's one you particularly wanted me to cover, I'll probably get to it then. So just stay tuned, I guess. Moving on to our first and only canon story of the week, Wolverine Save the Tiger. This book rules. It's essentially a prequel to Wolverine Volume 2 and Logan's adventures in Madripoor as Patch. This story was originally released across the first 10 issues of Marvel Comics Presents, Volume 1 in 1988, where it was the main story of 4 in each issue. And then it was one of the few stories from Presents that eventually got collected into its own book in 1992, which is how I read it, and why I'm doing this so late. This story is really damn good. It follows Logan on his first return to Madripoor. We still don't know his first time here, but that doesn't matter. This time he gets wrapped up in a gang war between the current gang leader, Roche, and a new up-and-comer, a woman who goes by the name Tiger. Tiger turns out to be the banker chick he and the X-Men saved from the Reavers at the start of the Outback era, who has had a large change in life since then. The story itself is paced really well. Buscema's art is great, and I just love whenever Claremont gets to write a solo Wolverine adventure. It's always a blast. I just love how he writes the character. We'll say I don't think the story does a great job of setting up Wolverine's Patch persona, but it's good enough, I guess, and it sets the stage for what happens in his ongoing. And I feel like even despite those complaints, or I guess complaint, singular, this story gets a 9. I loved this. Go read it if you haven't. It's a blast. Finally, to round out this weird selection of comics, we have Marvel and DC Present featuring the Uncanny X-Men and the New Teen Titans. This book came out back in 1981 with a couple of other Marvel DC crossover books, so I probably should have read it earlier, similar to Wolverine Save the Tiger. But hey, better late than never, I suppose. For posterity's sake, going into this, I knew I was going to love this book. I'm obviously a big fan of the X-Men, or at least I've become a big fan of the X-Men. But if you haven't watched my New Mutants videos, especially my early ones, you will know that I'm a sucker for a teen team, and the Teen Titans are the quintessential teen team. And it's the classic roster, too. Dick, Wally, Donna, Gar, Vic, Corey, and Raven. So there was no way this book could get lower than a 7 for me. And boy was I right, this book's awesome. Darkseid plans on using the Dark Phoenix to turn Earth into a second apocalypse, but is stopped by the Teen Titans and the X-Men. The grandiose nature of the villains here and the plot really end up elevating the book for me. I still would have enjoyed it if the two teams just did a normal team up against something more normal, like Magneto or the Brotherhood or just Deathstroke or whoever the fuck. But I think having Darkseid in here with like the Source Wall and the Phoenix Force and Metron, it just has this weird wow factor for me that really escalates it. There's a part of me that would have loved for this to be like a 2 or 3 issue miniseries just so we can live in this combined Marvel DC world for longer. But at the same time, I wonder if extending that would have diluted it. It'd be too much of a good thing, less is more type beat. But either way, this was really awesome. I love this. It gets an 8 out of 10. Go read it. That's all for this week, though. Obviously, Teen Titans Uncanny X-Men will be added to the completed series rankings, as well as What If Volume 1 and Wolverine Save the Tiger. What If Ellipses Volume 1 will stay around for now because there's still a bunch more of those to go through later down the line. And I've already said my rankings for those, and since, especially for Wolverine Save the Tiger and X-Men Teen Titans, those are both single issues, so they'll just get added as is. There's no calculation that needs to go into those. But with that all said, I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you did, please hit the like button and comment your thoughts on all these issues down below. Next week, we return to the cycle of ongoings with Wolverine Volume 2, concerning the Jenna Stone affair and beyond that. So subscribe, hit the bell, and I will see you all then.